This video is entitled Annotative Objects 101. And what I'm going to try to do here is demonstrate and show you how to set up and use annotative objects. In this example, I'm going to use annotative text, symbols, and points. And if you're new to the concept of annotative objects, essentially what they do is they change the scale by changing an annotative scale, which is a variable in IntelliCAD or AutoCAD. I'm using IntelliCAD, you can see here, and really AutoCAD is essentially exactly the same way, all the same variables. You may see some slightly different prompts, but you can apply everything I'm going to show you here to AutoCAD as well. So let me just first start by showing you what this does and what it looks like. So what you have here that you're looking at is a plan that I drew at 1 inch equals 40 feet. So I drew the whole thing, labeled it with the text size and everything based at 1 inch equals 40 feet. And I am going to change the scale. So if I go to the drawing setup, and I'm going to move it over to the side so you can see what happens. The horizontal scale is 40. So I'm just going to simply change it to 20. Now, the one thing I want to point out is that the LT scale changes with the horizontal scale. So at 40, it's set at 1 because that's where I put it. And now I put it at 20 and it cuts it in half. It's now a 0.5. So I'm going to change that back to a 1. Now I have to do that manually. And I'm going to talk about why we do that later on. But I'm going to set the LT scale to 1, and I'm going to recommend right now and continue to recommend that the LT scale is always a value of 1. I'll demonstrate that more. But so the horizontal scale is now 20. When I hit OK, if you see the screen, everything just got smaller. So as opposed to the going through the effort of rescaling a drawing, which we have a tool to rescale it, it actually scales the object. So what's also very convenient about this, the drawing setup, back here, I'm going to change it back to 40, and again, you see the LT scale, I got to change that manually back to 1. Okay, everything's big again. So the other great advantage to this is in paper space. So I'm going to go into a layout tab, and I've got 2 viewports. One viewport is at 1 inch equals 40, the other one is at 1 inch equals 20. So they can be at different scales, and what you notice is the graphic, you're seeing much more in a 1 inch equals 20. So let's say we wanted to do a detail of this, and it was too crowded here. So I create this separate viewport. But if you look at this text, here in the 1 inch equals 20 viewport and in the 1 inch equals 40 viewport, they're the same size. So it's set by, the text is set by a paper text height. So when you print it, when you send it to the printer, the text height is exactly the same. The symbol as well is relative to the scale of the viewport. So that's what's great about using annotative entities, objects. And in addition to that, you can also see that in the 1 inch equals 20 viewport, I don't have the benchmark in there. So you can freeze and thaw layers individually from each viewport. Now that's not a product of the annotative scale. You can do that even without using annotative objects. But it's a good thing to point out, because when you're using multiple viewports like this, you can set up each layer, turn them on and off, even change colors and line types per viewport. So very useful tool. And I also want to point out the fact that the text, the edge of pavement, is in a different location in this viewport than it is in this viewport. So they can be moved separately based upon the scale. Same thing with the IP found annotation. It's down off to the right here and up to the left here. So that's the value of it. It proves to be incredibly useful and especially when you're going to be doing things like this, or if somebody just requires that you change the scale of the drawing. Without going through a lot of effort, you just simply change the scale. So how did I do this? How did I create this? And that's what we're going to do next. So let's start from scratch, and I'll show you how I created exactly what you see in front of you here. So the first thing I want to talk about is the annotation scales themselves. So if you look down on the lower right, well, it's kind of close to the middle, the bar at the bottom of the drawing, there is an annotation scale. And this is an annotation scale list, actually. So right now it says 1 inch equals 40. If I right click in this spot, it brings up a list of annotated scales. So these are drawing scales that I created. So right off the bat, I would recommend that you put in only the scales that you normally use. The default when you first load up IntelliCAD has a whole list of scales in here. They don't necessarily look exactly like this, and there's architectural scales and all kinds of other scales that you might not use. So keeping your scale list clean helps you a lot further down the road. So that's my first recommendation. So what scale list is simply this. If I'm set, my current one is 1 inch equals 40. If I hit modify, you'll see what that looks like. There's a name as it appears in the scale list, and that can be user defined, but I'm going to tell you that it's kind of actually critical that you uniformly name these scales. So this is 1 inch with a space equals space 40 feet. If you bring it into another drawing, or say you're sharing platforms with like AutoCAD, this is IntelliCAD, so if I send this over to AutoCAD, AutoCAD automatically names their scales exactly like this, including the spaces. So if it's not named the same, it actually sees it as a different scale, even though it isn't. So name it uniformly. So here's the name of the scale, though, and then the actual scale are paper units, which is your paper space, which are in terms of inches in U.S. terms. This works exactly the same for meters, but your values here are obviously different. But you have your paper units and your drawing units. So this is essentially meaning one paper unit inch equals 40 feet, which is 40 CAD units. So that's the way a scale works. So for example, let's create a new one here. So I've got 10 through 100. If I add another one, let's say I'm going to make 1 inch equals 200. I say 1 inch space equals space 200 feet. That's the way I'm going to have it look. So the paper unit is 1, the drawing unit is 200. So very simple. And you can order your list here. Didn't put that in order automatically, but I hit OK. So now when I go to here and look at my annotation scale, as you can see the flyout tooltip there, right click, I've got 1 to 1 and then 10 through 200. So now let's continue by creating text. So I'm going to type style. You can, if you like using the pull downs, I think the text set style is right here, but you can just type the word style, the command prompt. So here's the standard text style that comes in every drawing. So it might not have the same font, but every drawing has a text style called standard. So always remember that the text style and the font are two different things. The font is contained within the style. So you can change the font to anything you want and to the name of the style, anything you want. And right here is the annotative button. So what I'm going to do is create a new style. So another recommendation I'll get to right here off the bat is to create annotative text styles that you're going to use for your drawings, for all your general annotations. So I'm going to start by doing that. I'm going to create new, and I'm going to create a text style, and I'm going to call it demo anno for annotative style. And I can pick any font that I want. I'll just leave it on Arial, the same as standard. And I'm going to turn on annotative. So that's really all you have to do. Create a style and make it annotative. But then you set a paper text height. So if you look back at standard, I want to save that. It's got a fixed height of 0, but it's not annotative. None of these that I have in here have an actual fixed height to them. So for my annotative, my demo anno, I'm going to actually put in a paper text height. So what that is how big the text is going to be at a plotted scale. So it's different than in model space. If you're running creating a drawing and it's 1 inch equals 40 feet and you're annotating things, that you probably will have a text height somewhere around 4 feet high because it's in model space, so it's scaled by the drawing scale. So 1 inch equals 40, a text height of 0.1 ends up being 4 feet high. So in paper text height, you actually just type in how big it's going to be when you send it to the printer. So I'm going to say I want it 0.1. So that's just kind of a standard text height. And then you can add in width factors and obliquing angles if you want. I'm not going to do that. So that's really all I have to do. Now I'm going to come back to this match orientation layout, and I'll create a separate text style for that. But let's just start with this one here and apply and hit OK. So now when I go to add a piece of text, I'll just use simply draw text, and I'll just use standard text, and I'll pick a spot on the screen. Rotation of the text is, because you notice it didn't ask a height because I have a preset height. My rotation is here, and I will just say this is demo-anno text. And there's my piece of text. Now, if I click on that piece of text and I look at the property, right here it says that it now says it's annotative. So yes, and it has an annotation scale applied to it. So this is created at 1 inch equals 40. If I click in here, there's a little box that pops up, and I can click on that box, and there's the scale list. Now what that is not the same as the scale list of what's available. That is what the scale is applied to this drawing. So you can see right here, the way I have this set up, I put this in at 1 inch equals 40, so that's the only scale that applies to this. So now, if I was to change my drawing scale, that piece of text is not going to change. Incidentally, we have a drawing setup. We have the drawing scale here, which I demonstrated. Change that to 20. And the text does not change. However, down here, my annotation scale list changed from 40 to 20. So this is a particular Carlson thing, that Carlson sets your annotation scale to your drawing scale. That's an option in the general setup, and I'm going to come back to that. But when I change this back, now watch right here, 1 inch equals 20. When I hit OK, that changes to 1 inch equals 40. So you can actually click here and just change your scale. However, this won't change because it only has one annotative scale applied to it. So if I want to add another scale, I can hit Add, and I'll just say 20. So now it has a 20 or a 40. So I can change it to a 20, and now you'll see it get smaller and bigger. Now notice this. If I go to a 30, nothing happens. Only 20 and 40, because those are the only two scales I applied to it. Now that's can be useful. So you can set this so only particular scales are seen as annotative. Now, there's a variable, and it's right here, auto annotate, auto annoscale. And if I right click on that, it's disabled. And if I enable that, what that does is it will automatically apply the scale as soon as I change it here. So now, if I change this and I go to 30, it does get smaller. So now I've got 20, 30, 40, and if I pick this and I list, it'll show you the scales that applied. So every time I change scale with that variable on, there's a 200, huge. This now has that applied to it. So that's really useful, but it's also something you control if you don't want annotative scales applied every time you change the scale of your drawing. So I'll go back to 40. So that's the basic idea of annotative text. So now we're going to take a look at how Carlson handles annotative text and objects. So what I previously showed you is really just straight IntelliCAD. And again, AutoCAD works the same way. So Carlson has a little different method, and you're ultimately going to use a combination of the two things. But to understand what Carlson's doing, let's just first take a look and try to understand how Carlson sizes text, because there's a lot of confusion on this anyways. If I just go look at my annotate defaults, you will see in the general tab under the annotate defaults a text size scaler, and you see that term scaler a lot in Carlson. Text size scaler, symbol size scaler, in just about any time that it places a symbol or text, any kind of annotation, there's a scaler associated with it. So what that scaler does is that is similar to what I put in there for the paper text height on that text style that I just created. I put in a 0.1. So Carlson sees that 0.1 and it multiplies it times whatever the drawing size is. So drawing scale, I mean, so if it's 1 inch equals 40, again, 0.1 will come out 4 feet high in your drawing. If you look at the tabs like the angle and distance, you'll see a text style that you can set. So remember, the text style can have a preset text height, or it can have a height of 0. Another recommendation I'm going to tell you is that I always have at least one text style with a 0 height, and I use that for Carlson annotations. I use the preset heights for general annotations. Okay, so this gets used by every time I label a bearing and distance, it's going to take this text style and it's going to apply this text size scaler. What might not be known to everyone or completely understood is that it will override, this height will override whatever the text style height is. So even if I use a preset height, if I have this scalar, the scalar is going to win. So it will override any preset text heights that in that particular style. So again, my recommendation is you have, my Roman S style, if you look at the style, it has 0 for a text height. So I don't have to worry about it stepping on the preset text height. It doesn't change it in the style, but when you annotate it, it will use that instead of the preset height. And that confuses people because they go and set their text styles up and they say, I want a particular height, and then they label it with Carlson, and Carlson uses this text scalar. Now, the reason why this is important is when you're using annotative text, it applies the same thing. The difference is that this will apply the text size scalar if you're in model space, and it will also set the text height as a paper space text height. So that's a lot to try to explain and understand, so I think it's just easiest if I demonstrate this. So a couple things have to be set here. So I start with the setup and I go into Carlson configure, and in the general settings there are options on the lower left, the first one being use annotative scale. So I could turn that off, the rest of these gray out. So use annotative scale. And then I have an option to support all drawing scales. You'll see in the future an option to only support specific drawing scales, but in running 2023 right now, that's your option to support all. If I unclick that, then I'm going to have to manually set scales after it's labeled. So I'm going to put that on, and again, that's another important reason to have a very clean scale list. Not too many scales that you have to deal with. The other thing is this set annotative to drawing scale. That is the drawing scale that we set in the drawing setup. That's the option to make it change the annotation scale, which is this the CAD, IntelliCAD's scale variable. So then there's an option here to put in a scale prefix and suffix. So if you saw when it creates a new scale, because Carlson will create these scales on the fly if they don't exist, the text itself anyways. So, and you can create it with whatever specific display you want. So if you remember back where I created the text style, I was very particular about 1 inch equals with spaces and a foot at the end. So that is a way to make it uniform and more automated. So you want to set that. And I really recommend that if you're in US feet, this is exactly how you set it. Inch, space, equals, space, foot. All right, so that's what you do to turn on annotative text. Now, for points and symbols, you actually go into the points menu and hit point defaults. And right here is very similar. Use annotative points and support all drawing scales. So I'm going to turn those on. It's the same kind of thing. So when I'm drawing points, it's going to make them annotative points. So I hit OK there. Let's just do something like add a lot area to this. If I look at my area defaults, I don't have to add in annotative anything here because it's part of the general settings. So I don't have to go through on each one of these and tell it it's going to be annotative or not. So these are my just annotative default settings. And I'm going to go to area layout and area by closed polyline, and I will pick this boundary line, lot 1, and drops it in. So that, if I click on it, now you can see that it says it's annotative. And yes, annotation scale, it's at 1 inch equals 40 because that's my drawing setup right now. when I created it. But if I click on the button over to the right, there it is. There are all my annotation scales. So those match everything that's in the scale list, including the new one I just put in. So now, if I am to change the drawing scale, let's change it to 10. 1 inch equals 10 feet, and there it is. It's that simple. Drawing setup. I'm going to go back to 40. And hit OK. Now the same thing for annotating bearings and distances. I'm going to do it quickly by using Auto Annotate. I have mine set up by layer, which I have other videos on how you do that. And I'll just pick that, and there's all my annotations. Same thing. These are all annotative now. If I pick up on any piece of text, annotation scale, there they all are. So when I change scales, they're all going to respond accordingly. Now, I promised I would talk about line type scale, so we're going to do that right now. So the line type scale is set here. If you type it at the command line, it is LT scale, and it is set at 1. So it's going to follow whatever's in the drawing setup. So you really can't see it with a continuous line type here, so I'm going to go to my boundary layer. Let's just change the line type to something like phantom line type in here. Yeah, let's go with the phantom line type. So we get some dashes in there. All right, so that's the way this looks. Now, if my LT scale is set to 1, it will respond to whatever the annotation scale is set to. Now, what's critical about this is to get this to respond correctly in both model space and paper space. There's 2 more variables that you have to set. One of them is MS LT scale, which stands for model space LT scale, and this has a value of either on or off. If it's on, that means it follows the LT scale, which of course follows the annotation scale. So you want that on. And in AutoCAD, incidentally, it's a toggle of either a 0 or 1, so 1 would make it on. The other variable is PS LT scale, and that is also on, or in AutoCAD would have the toggle of 1. So both the line type, paper space and model space scales, line types will always look the same. So if you are dealing with an issue that when you go into your models, your paper space, your line types don't look correct, or when you go in your model space, they don't look the correct, or the same at least, that's why you could need to set those variables. So those three variables, LT scale, MSLT scale, and PSLT scale, all set to 1 or on, and you won't have that problem anymore. So now what that means is when I change to 20, you'll see that the LT scale adjusts accordingly. So a very important fact to remember here is if you change the Carlson drawing scale through the drawing setup, change that to a 20, it changes the annotation scale here. However, it doesn't work in reverse. So even though this is a little quicker, you just double click here and I say I want to pick 40. You can bounce back and forth 30. It is much more effective and safer to use the drawing setup instead of just clicking back and forth like this, because you can get yourself out of sync with the drawing scale. So use the drawing setup and set the drawing scale here when you're going to do an overall drawing scale change. That's setting the viewport scale is a little differently, but you don't want to get yourself out of sync it will cause problems. So now I'm going to bring in some field data into this plan. So I'm going to go right from survey into draw field to finish. And this is just a little sample code table that I have set up. But I'm going to go into edit codes, and let's just take a look at any code here. I'll take a look at the iron pipe found, IPF, and you'll see that there's an option here to allow annotative. So that fortunately is the default that's on when you create a code table, but you can turn it off if you don't want annotative objects. So with this on, whatever symbol I pick here will be created as an annotative symbol. Likewise, the points themselves that come in will be annotative. So I don't need to change that. So I'm just going to draw this little data set. And what I've got here is 3 iron pipes found. I got a benchmark, edge of pavement, and a little house. So again, everything in here is now annotative. So if I needed to change the drawing overall scale, I could just go back again, change that to a 20. And we're going to change this to give us an option to have LT scale always at 1. But right now you have to manually set that. I hit OK. Everything gets more readable because it sizes, including the points, the Carlson points, all the text, and all the symbols. So closely at this, change this back to 40. It gets bigger. All right. So what's unique about this is the fact that I can move the text around in one scale versus another scale. So all this text can be in a couple different positions. So here's a good example. I can't have this text overriding here. So I'm going to pick this iron pipe and move it over here. This TBM, that's up over here. Put it like that. And that's a benchmark right there. This edge of pavement, I'm going to put it over here. And this iron pipe found is probably okay. So I think I can freeze my points, clean up my drawing here a little bit, so they all have nodes in front of them. So I'm just going to take all of those and freeze them. And that's not true. What are those on? Oh, that's not true. So let me freeze these attributes here. All right. So that cleans up my drawing a little bit. So now if I change, I'm going to use the quick way here temporarily and just change that to a 20 scale. So everything moves back to the original position. So this, I'm going to move here. That one's fine, and that one's fine. But you notice this one was off to the side. So just watch as I change back and forth. 20, 40. So each one of these scales can have the text placed in an individual location. Now, likewise, I can draw a leader and make it annotative. So I'm going to set to this layer here, for instance, and I can use the leader command and make this leader annotative. So right now I just drew that, and I can change it to annotative. Here's my annotation scales. Do the same thing. So now since I just drew that, now incidentally I'm not going to go that far into this. This is Annotative 101, but your dimension styles are the same type of thing. They can be created as annotative dimension styles. So I drew this with a leader, not using an annotative style. But what I can do is now I can add all these styles and just shift and right click and grab all of them. It adds all those to the layer, which allows me then to change scales and alter the leader to a different position. And incidentally, I'm making these edits using the grips. So if you use an actual move command, you get a different result. So it actually moves the text. So the grip edit is particular in this editing. But now that I have that set up, I can go from the 40 to 20 and it looks the way I want. So each one of these things can be adjusted, moved around, and annotated just the way you want for the individual scale. So I'm still at a 40 scale. I'm going to go back to here just to reiterate. When you want to do an overall scale, make sure you change it there so you don't get out of sync. So I added one more little piece of text for the existing building, and now we're ready to create some viewports in Paperspace and print out this plan. So we'll go to a brand new layout tab. When you do that, by default, now this is a setting, it creates a viewport. So it creates a viewport, and I don't have a particular template involved here, so that's certainly a recommendation. But what it did is it created a piece of paper at 8.5 by 11. So the first thing I'm going to do is change that by going to my page setup manager and modify this. And let's just make it a tabloid size. I'm going to a PDF, so it's rather small, and just hit OK. And what that does is just gives me some more working room here. So even though it created a viewport automatically, it didn't set it at any particular scale. It just kind of did a zoom extents. So it's not at a particular scale. So if I was to print this now, it would not be to scale. You can see that the annotation scale is 1 to 40 because that's the way it was set in model space, but the standard scale, which says custom, which really means it's just whatever it is, some odd scale. So I'm going to change that to 1 which equals 40, and you can see that it now scaled that. So that's very important. So when you print your viewport, it's the correct scale. So I'm going to print it, state that it's 1 inch equals 40. So you want to make sure it really is. So now what I'm going to do is just simply copy this viewport off to the side. And maybe I'll line these two up a little bit better than that. So this is 1 inch equals 40. I want this 1 inch equals 20. So you can see it all fits in there. When I go here, and I'm going to change this standard scale to 1 inch equals 20, and the annotation scale also to 1 inch equals 20. And it's a little interesting that you can actually have those set differently, but certainly in most cases you're going to want to have them exactly the same. So you can see what happened in this little bit here. It doesn't fit at 1 inch equals 20. So I can double click in this space, and now I can just pan to the area I want in my detail. And you notice again, the text size is the same, the symbols, relative to the same. When you print it, it's going to look right in both situations. But the text has been moved, the line type is regenerated so it looks right when you print it, because of everything following that annotation scale. Now, to demonstrate the layer part again, it's not particular to the annotative properties, but I do want to show you that you can click in a viewport. I can use my layer manager, and if you look at my layer manager, so here's my benchmark. Let's say I don't want that in my 20 scale drawing. So if I pick that, you can see your regular line type, on, off, freeze, thaw, line weight, transparent, all those kind of qualities for the layer. But when you scoot over to the right, you'll say viewport of the same name. So you can see that I can actually change the color of the viewport different than in model space. So one viewport can have different colors than the other. So that allows you to do things like, let's say it's an existing conditions plan. In the same drawing, you can have all your existing conditions layer shaded back so your proposed entities stand out better. So individual line types, everything. What I'm going to do is just right here, current viewport, I can freeze it. So if I freeze the benchmark in one viewport, it's gone in this viewport, but it's still in that viewport. So this is my 1 inch equals 20. This is my 1 inch equals 40. If I were to add text in paper space, I can still use the same annotative text style. And I type text. One inch equals 40 feet. And here is 1 inch equals 20 feet. Using the same text, because annotative, when you're in paper space, it's 1-to-1. You can still use your same annotative text style in paper space as you do in model space, so you don't have to have a multitude of different text styles to make this work. So that is the basics of annotative text. Give it a shot. When you get used to it, there's, like anything, there's a little learning curve. Oh, very important thing here before I get off of it. These viewports, once you have them set up the way you like them, very important to just lock the display. So if I do that, you can't rescale this viewport anymore. So I can't change that scale because if you're in a viewport and you zoom in or out, you're actually effectively changing the scale. So very important once you get this done to lock your viewports. Give this a shot. When you get this kind of under your belt, you will see just how useful it is. It's not as difficult as it's often thought of. So I'm going to leave you with what I'm going to call my 3 best practices. And that is to create a text style with a 0 height for all of your Carlson annotations. So that's your bearings, distances, slot areas, anything that's automated by Carlson, including everything in field to finish, because Carlson will apply the text scaler and you want your text height to be set at 0. Then you create an annotative text style for all your general annotations, like where I'm typing in things like the existing building and a road name and whatever other drafting cosmetics you need. And then importantly, set all your LT variables to keep all your line types looking correct. Set your LT scale to 1, and your MSLT scale in AutoCAD is a 1, in IntelliCAD is on, and your PSLT scale is 1, and again in IntelliCAD that is on. Best of luck, and thanks for watching.